When You're Here, You're Fatalities by Nicholas P. Robinson. Of course the friggin' place was closing down. That's how it had to work. The economy was trash, and jobs weren't easy to come by. So Donna took the waitressing job at the third-rate Italian chain restaurant Pimento Patch. Every town with a population greater than 50,000 seemed to have a Pimento Patch, with its bargain basement menu and unlimited watery soup and stale breadsticks, enticing impoverished people to gorge themselves while the gorging was good. The fraudulent Italian cuisine and ersatz villa decor only fooled the truly deluded into convincing themselves that they were experiencing fine Italian dining in a family atmosphere. It turned Donna's stomach every time she walked through the employee entrance. She hadn't spent 6 years studying art history to end up peddling the equivalent of Stouffer's frozen meals to pretentious GED graduates and their screeching hordes of children, enclosed within what looked like a shut-in's impression of an Italian town square. In that respect, the imminent shutdown was a blessing. As far as her survivability odds were concerned, it was less of a blessing. The owner at least guaranteed the staff payroll, and she suspected it might be coming out of his pocket. That was something. Too bad her hourly wage was only $4 before tips, and there hadn't been much by way of tipping in the first place. Tips required customers, and Pimento Patch hadn't received much for customers since Donna started. It was better than nothing, but only just. When the owner offered to pay the staff members to stick around and deep clean the place in preparation for closure, most front-of-house employees declined. They were almost universally pretty young things just out of high school, still optimistic that the world owed them comfortable livings. Then there was Donna, with her brunette hair severely pulled back from her too angular resting bitch face that seemed to indicate she was always in a state of rest. She was prettier than average, but she was all too conscious that she was approaching 30 and didn't have the curves in the right proportions to compete with her younger coworkers. Naturally, she'd volunteered to stick around for cleanup duties along with 3 of the kitchen staff and 1 of the hosts, an unrepentant stoner by the name of Steve. The way she saw it, Stoner Steve was lucky the place was shutting down when it was, because he'd walked a razor-thin line between employment and termination for altogether too long. It had been obvious to everyone, including Donna, that the management was tired of his constant tardiness, disrespectful mockery of guests, and overall slacker demeanor. It was no surprise that he'd be milking the clock until the last possible second, but Donna couldn't criticize him for it since she was planning to do the same. The final Pimento Patch patrons had been ushered through the exit an hour before Donna stepped outside to enjoy what would probably be her last cigarette until the cleanup was complete. The only cars in the dark parking lot were those belonging to the staff, committed to the deep clean already underway. An unbroken sheet of gray blanketing the night sky threatened rain or snow, though the early winter had remained autumnal in both temperament and temperature, so the rain was far more likely. Nevertheless, there was still a chill in the air that made the smoke less flavorful than she'd like, but she'd stick it out just the same. Stoner and slacker he might be, but Steve had seniority, and he occasionally also had good ideas, Donna had to admit. Steve was the one who suggested they focus on cleaning up and organizing the front of house right away, tackling the dining areas, lobby, and bar to build up an appetite before they moved on to the kitchen. There was a certain unassailable logic behind avoiding any chance of cleaning the kitchen twice, waiting until they'd had a chance to eat before getting started on what would be the most challenging element of the overnight cleanup. By splitting up the dining areas between them, hoping to make short work of it, the whole process only took a little more than an hour, wiping down tables and chairs, vacuuming the floors, and stacking the furniture was the easiest part of the job they had ahead of them. It was a strangely somber atmosphere in the restaurant as they worked. The clatter of wood on wood, the whoosh of the vacuums, and the faint music still broadcasting through the hidden speakers only managed to make Donna feel more isolated and alone. There was something eerie about the whole experience. The typical closing shifts involved more conversation and chatter between the employees performing their cleanup duties, but it seemed like no one was really in the mood for idle chit-chat that night. The 5 of them sat in a circle, Donna and Stacy on the floor, and the others hoisted up on the food prep counters as the joint got passed around. "It's a shame this place never bounced back," Stacy said, as she passed the joint up to Steve. He inhaled deeply and held in the smoke for a few seconds, before exhaling and saying, "There was no way people were going to forget something like that." "What are you guys talking about?" Donna looked at Stacy, hoping for an explanation. "The deaths, you know." Stacy sounded so casual as she answered, as if that would be all the description Donna should need. The blank expression on Donna's face told a different story. "How do you not know the sinister history of this place?" Andrew looked stunned, unable to process Donna's ignorance. "Are you guys fucking with me? Is this some sort of campfire tales scenario?" "Holy shit!" Steve's voice erupted, followed by laughter. "You really have no idea, do you?" "Should we tell her?" Max smirked as he took the joint from Steve. "A friggin' course we should," Andrew said. "I'll tell the story," Steve said, as he slid forward from where he was seated on the prep counter, his feet slapping the ground with a loud, dramatic smack. "Drew and I were both working here when it happened. The rest of you didn't show up until after the fact." "Hit us with it, boss," Max said. His grin indicated he'd heard the story a few times. Steve grabbed the joint back from Max, inhaled deeply before returning the joint to his friend, and began to speak with a voice artificially deepened by the breath holding in the smoke. "There was this absolute mountain of a man who came in here one night. It was him and his whole family." He paused to exhale a cloud of smoke. "Dude was massive, easily 400 pounds or more, and he had to be pushing 50. The whole family was a bunch of fat cows. It should be no surprise that they'd come in for the unlimited soup, salad, and breadsticks deal." Some of the gathered audience chuckled at that, having seen the type come through the door on more occasions than they could count. 2 hours into the meal and the dude was still going strong. Steve made eye contact with Donna. "You've seen folks like that in just your brief time with us." Not sure if he was looking for acknowledgement or if it was rhetorical, Donna opted to nod her head just in case. "This girl, Julia, was their waitress, and she was getting worried because the big guy was starting to get flushed, like beet red, and his breathing was heavier. He was sweating bad enough that it was showing through his shirt." Stacy made a gagging noise and giggled as she took the offered joint from Andrew. "Julia pulled the manager aside. This guy was an asshole named Luke or Lucas, I can't remember. He left the company the following week." Steve paused before continuing. "Anyway, Julia asked if she could have him cut the customer off because she didn't think he was healthy." "She should have told him it was to save the company money," Andrew chimed in. "That's what would have gotten Luke's attention." Steve smirked at that. "She was told to do her job and continue serving the fat guy, so that's what she did. She kept on bringing him new soup and breadsticks right up until he keeled over in front of her, splashing a bowl of gnocchi on her uniform. You could have heard her screaming from the mall food court across the parking lot, Andrew suggested. It was super weird, too, Steve said. There wasn't any of that gasping or choking you'd expect. 1 second, the guy was sitting there waiting for what had to be his 10th bowl of soup, and the next, he was tipping over and taking the chair with him. The friggin' thing was in splinters under his weight. Donna winced, trying to imagine what she'd do if she ever witnessed something like that. The dining room was full. We used to fill up on evenings until there was a wait list at the front lobby. Steve put out what was left of the roach and tucked it into his pack of cigarettes. The place went nuts. People freaking out. Some folks even throwing up. It was friggin' turmoil. Andrew glanced over at Donna before he said, It took 2 days with the place shut down for us to get it clean. The owner brought in a professional cleaning crew and everything. Julia never bounced back after that happened, Steve continued. She was like a fucking zombie around here. I don't even know why she kept coming in. Probably couldn't find anything else, Stacy suggested. It's no different for the rest of us. Well, one night, just before closing time, Julia offed herself right here in the pantry. She grabbed the vacuum, unspooled the cord, looped it around the top rail of the metal shelf, and made a noose with the other end. Donna didn't realize she'd been holding her breath until it burst out with a sudden surprised exhale. She killed herself here? She glanced between Steve and Andrew, hoping that they were just telling tales, but the sincerity in their eyes told her all she needed to know. Yeah, the prongs from the plug even dug into her throat, and she bled all over the place, Andrew replied. No one here knows whether she died from strangulation or blood loss, but I don't know that it matters, Steve said. Jesus Christ. Donna didn't know what else to say. It's a miracle this place stayed open this long, Max said. When they first told me about this shit, I figured it was some ghost story to initiate new staff. The group remained silent for a couple of minutes, no one knowing what else to say. Well, let's cook up some of this shit before it all goes to waste, Max finally suggested. Donna and Stacy both glanced over to him with perplexed looks. What? He shrugged. I'm friggin' high, and I may as well get a good company meal on the last day here. Regardless of how much the story might have spoiled their appetites, Max wasn't wrong about the munchies coming on, and everyone ultimately decided they should eat. Donna slipped outside for another cigarette after overindulging on pasta and meat sauce, a meal she'd regret when it came time to burn off the excess calories she just consumed. The night was still as gray as when she'd been outside before, the clouds hanging lower in the sky and taking on a faint orange hue from the sodium lights dotting the streets. It was still, but there was a looming thread of chilly rain that she could feel in the air. There was no question it would be drizzling soon. If she had to guess, she'd suggest it would probably be pouring by the time they locked the doors to Pimento Patch for the last time. Lost in her meandering thoughts, Donna similarly lost track of time, standing in the chill outside. Her cigarette, mostly forgotten, had extinguished itself as the cherry reached the filter. She hadn't gotten high like that since she was in college, and the odds were good that she wouldn't be doing so again for a long time, if ever again. She felt like she was experiencing the world around her through a viscous fluid of some kind, with all of her senses dulled. Tossing the remains of her cigarette to the parking lot, she turned around and let herself back inside. The music pumped through the speakers seemed both louder than she remembered it being, and yet hazy and muffled. She hoped she could sober up before it was time to head home. Not eager to join everyone in the kitchen for the rest of the cleanup right away, she wandered aimlessly through the lobby and into the dining rooms, letting her shuffling feet guide her. No one was supposed to be eating in the dining room after they'd cleaned it up and stacked the furniture. One of them had gotten too high to remember because it was obvious someone had carried a plate of food into the back dining space. Someone had spilled marinara on the carpet after she'd taken the time to vacuum the floor in that section. The deep red stain had already started to stick, and there was no chance she was going to get on her hands and knees to scrub it away. Maybe after it dried, she could go over the section of carpet again with the vacuum and pull some of the stains from the carpet fibers. "Which one of you inconsiderate assholes was eating in here after I cleaned up?" Donna's voice carried through the empty dining area of the restaurant, but drowned out before it was heard by anyone in the kitchen, where the radio was playing at high volume. Irritated, she noticed another patch of the watery marinara on the carpet, and then another. She followed the trail of dribbled sauce toward one of the booths she'd wiped down less than an hour earlier. Splashes of red dotted the table and the tacky Naugahyde seat. "Fuckers," she muttered the word to herself as she turned away from the mess before stomping back to where she'd left the bucket and rag she'd used to wipe everything down. Breaking her promise to herself, Donna did her best to scrub the stain from the carpet, the water in the bucket quickly turning pink and her knees becoming sore. It was only from her vantage point at floor level that she noticed the additional spill along the edge of the booth space beneath the overhanging lip of the seat. Puzzled, she sat back with her butt resting on the heels of her feet, tilting her head just slightly. How the hell did you get sauce there? Sliding herself forward on her knees, she prepared to scrub down the booth when her look of puzzlement transformed into a glare. Donna suddenly imagined one of her slacker co-workers spilling food and then tossing the plate and solid waste into the storage space beneath the seat instead of returning to the kitchen. She could almost see the whole scene playing out, the face of the unknown slob transforming as different culprits flashed through her imagination. It was ridiculous, but it wasn't something out of character for the people she'd found herself working with that night. Rising slowly to her feet with her knees protesting their ill treatment, Donna let the filthy rag drop into the bucket, the water splashing on the floor with the impact. She gripped the edge of the seat and lifted it, pushing it away from her and toward the window facing the darkness of the parking lot outside, before she reflexively jerked her hands away. Donna's breath caught in her throat as she desperately struggled to make sense of what she was staring at in the cavity where the owner normally had festive holiday decorations kept in storage. For just a split second, she questioned whether Steve's weed had been laced with something, because there was no way she could be seeing what was right in front of her. A strangled, wheezing sound intruded on her awareness, and she briefly wondered what the hell it was until she realized she was attempting to scream with no breath in her lungs. She turned her gaze to her hands, taking in the reddish stains on the cuticles of her nails. It wasn't marinara. There, crumpled in the storage space beneath the booth, her limbs contorted like a broken doll casually discarded by a sadistic child, Stacy had been forced into the cavity. Facing up toward Donna, Stacy's head was twisted around, facing the wrong way. Her chin was resting between her shoulder blades. Snapped twigs of spaghetti littered her hair from where it had broken when the seat had been forced down to bury Stacy in her disgraceful grave. Protruding from both of her eye sockets, the jagged remains of bundled noodles stood straight, the opposite ends lodged somewhere in the gray matter of her brain. Blood and vitreous humor had oozed out onto the girl's cheeks, coating the skin in a tacky, gelatinous pink fluid. Donna didn't notice that she was backing away until she bumped up against the chair stacked on the table behind her. She jumped and spun around, expecting to find Stacy's murderer awaiting her with some manner of pasta implement in hand. The chair still shaking from the collision, Donna inhaled her breath to scream when a crash erupted from the direction of the main lobby. After tracking the damn thing down, because someone had misplaced it, Steve carefully maneuvered the ladder through the lobby before slowly raising it to rest against the edge of the faux balcony, where the pointless, empty chairs and table greeted customers as they got escorted to their seating. It was stupid, and it looked ridiculous to him, but now he had to climb up there to unplug the Christmas tree and lights that he'd just been asked to put in place only a week earlier. He didn't care for heights, but he was the only person on staff willing to climb up to the damn ceiling to dust and decorate the space. Steve suspected that was the only reason he was still employed there. He'd been working at Pimento Patch for a couple of years, complacent and increasingly disengaged from the customer service aspect of his position. The way he figured it, the boss kept him around because the owner was probably terrified of heights, and it was the one thing he could count on Steve to do without complaint. One final time, he reminded himself, and he'd never have to haul the ladder through the restaurant again. He had no idea what he was supposed to do when Pimento Patch shut down. He figured he could still make enough from selling crystal to kitchen staff around town, but he wasn't eager to take up the mantle of a full-time drug dealer. He'd figure something out, though. As shitty and fake as the restaurant was, the ladder was at least sturdy. Grabbing the handrails of the wrought iron balcony, Steve prepared to hoist himself over the edge when he caught sight of Andrew seated against the wall behind the lit-up Christmas tree. Steve smiled, surprised and amused. "Dude, what the fuck are you doing up here?" He barely finished the question before he realized the dishwasher wouldn't answer him. He couldn't answer. The scene lit by flashing lights of various colors, Steve saw that Andrew's stomach had been ripped open. The gaping, ragged-edged cavity of his abdomen had been stuffed with dozens of breadsticks, lined up like they were in a basket for presentation. "What the fuck?" Steve muttered the words to himself as he let go of the railing without thinking. He'd already started to tip backward before he tried to lunge back for the rail, but his reflexes were too deadened by the weed he'd just been smoking in the kitchen. His arms wheeling frantically, Steve lost his footing on the ladder and fell. His lower spine fractured as it slammed against the leg support of one of the chairs he'd stacked on the table just a couple of hours earlier. The table's legs on the side nearest the blow, not designed for that sort of impact, splintered and sent the assortment of chairs toppling onto the floor with Steve. A gnarled mess of splintered bone and wood, Steve was lucky he couldn't feel the pain. He couldn't feel anything at all. His eyes lost focus as his final breath passed his trembling lips, and the last thing Steve saw was a shadowy figure receding into the darkness at the edges of his vision, just before Donna dropped to her knees beside him. Just after the lights went out for Steve, the lights in the restaurant went out as well. Donna had just enough time to take in the broken mess of furniture and Steve's crooked limbs when the darkness enveloped her. The shadows leaped out at her as her mind raced, confusion and fear swirling together into a dizzying whirlpool of disorganized thoughts and sensations. The lobby was only lit by the faint glow of the lights from the parking lot. Everything seemed suddenly unfamiliar and sinister. She started to scream Andrew's name before choking back the outburst after only the first syllable had emerged from between her lips, afraid to draw attention to herself after seeing what had happened to Stacy and now Steve. Donna ducked down into a crouch, hoping to disappear below the level of the stacked furniture all around her. She didn't know if she was alone in the dark, but she couldn't shake the feeling like she'd slipped into a labyrinth as she crept toward the kitchen entrance. The door squeaked like a monstrous rodent without the noise from the speakers to hide it. The light from outside didn't penetrate the giant galley kitchen space, and she felt immediately terrified of the darkness embracing her from all sides. Paralyzed with fear, Donna remained stationary for the first couple of minutes before she thought to use her lighter. The hissing scrape of the thumb wheel produced an echoing sound in the space, but the flickering flame provided her with just enough light to take in her immediate surroundings. She wished she'd left it dark. Max was sprawled out along the stainless steel surface of the prep counter, stale, hard-crusted breadsticks jutting up from his eyes and his mouth, the lower portions looking as if they'd been dipped in a sauce that took Donna a few seconds to recognize for the blood and chunks of gray matter that it was. They were all dead. Everyone but her and Andrew was dead. It had to be Andrew. But why? He'd always seemed like a nice guy, and she couldn't reconcile that seemingly harmless goofball with someone capable of doing these things. She backed away from the body in front of her and allowed her lighter to go out as she pushed through the double doors back to the dimly lit dining room. The sound of furtive movement from the direction of the entrance startled her, but Donna quickly scrambled across the carpeted space into the dining room nearest the kitchen entrance. Ducking down to hide behind the stacked table and chairs, she waited, her heart hammering away in her chest, her breath threatening to erupt in panicked hyperventilation. She felt as if there was nowhere she could hide. A sudden hint of movement in the shadows between the lobby and her hiding place forced her to plant the palm of her left hand over her mouth, stifling an unintentional squeal of terror. As the form moved in her direction, Donna quietly slid across the carpet, keeping the furniture between herself and the looming figure that had to be Andrew. If he knew where she was, he was toying with her. Hesitantly, the dark figure slipped into the kitchen. The sound of the door flapping closed behind him gave her courage to dart toward the next set of stacked furniture nearer the entrance. Donna came to a stop just in time as the doors opened again and the figure returned to the dining space. Peering through the slatted back of the chair hanging in front of her, she could just make out the legs of her pursuer as he stealthily moved toward where she'd been hiding only seconds before. Circling the table she was hiding behind, Donna maneuvered herself closer to the entrance and the presumed safety in the chilly night outside. Minutes passed as she played a silent game of cat and mouse with her murderous coworker, slipping back and forth, struggling to always keep some piece of furniture as well as a healthy distance between herself and the killer. Donna gradually made her way to the U-shaped bar that separated the lobby from the dining rooms. She was so close to the apparent safety outside. She could hear the patter of rain on the lobby windows, and she desperately wanted to bolt for the door, but she didn't know if she could outrun the man still prowling through the restaurant interior. Donna considered slipping her phone out of her pocket to dial 911, but she couldn't risk shifting her focus to the voice of a dispatcher when she needed to concentrate on every faint noise within the fake Tuscan villa of the Pimento Patch interior. She knew that she'd be dead the moment she stopped tuning in for every swish and tap of the killer's feet as he hunted for her. She couldn't just stay there behind the bar, though, either. It was her desire to drink something that provided Donna with both an idea for a distraction as well as her plan to escape the restaurant. She had a fully stocked bar at her disposal, and she had a lighter. Taking a swig of vodka to shore up her courage, Donna slipped to the end of the bar and began pouring out the bottle's contents onto the floor in a line between the bar and the nearest wall. She proceeded to do the same with another few bottles, careful to avoid any telltale sound of glass against glass, until she felt like she might choke from the smell of so much hard liquor pooling up on the floor. Flicking the thumb wheel of her lighter, Donna just happened to glance up in time to see a hooded form staring down at her from the opposite side of the bar. The face hidden in shadows, she nevertheless felt a predatory stare leveled her way as the lighter ignited. She almost dropped the lighter as the killer vaulted over the bar, but she kept it lit and brought the flame in contact with the alcohol. A bright blue flame burst from that point and spread in all directions, chasing the liquid she'd spilled all over the floor. The tiny hairs on Donna's hand were singed, but she hardly noticed as she pedaled backward, happy to see that the murderer had landed in the middle of the expanding flames from the igniting liquor. Hastily forcing herself to her feet and spinning toward the door, Donna ran as fast as she ever had to cross the dozen or so feet that separated her and the exit. Rocketing out into the rainy night, she yanked her phone from her pocket and had 911 dialed before she had time to turn around and glance back through the windows into the Pimento Patch lobby. Bottles of alcohol exploded in the spreading flames, and the fire took on a life of its own, but she couldn't see Andrew anywhere from her vantage point. Not wanting to wait for the killer to come erupting through the entrance, Donna began to run across the empty parking lot toward the mostly vacant mall in the distance. Breathlessly struggling to explain what had happened to the dispatcher who'd answered her call, Donna wasn't able to catch her breath until the police and emergency services arrived. By that time, the fire in the Pimento Patch had evolved into a massive conflagration that threatened to consume the whole building. Half an hour passed before the owner pulled up in his cream-colored sedan, having been notified by the fire department that his restaurant was in flames. As he embraced Donna, tears streaming down the woman's face, she failed to notice the smell of smoke on his clothing because she'd breathed in so much of it just from being in proximity to the fire. "It'll be all right, Donna," the old man said. His tone was comforting and paternal. "But everyone's dead." Her voice hitched with sobs as she tried to explain everything. "I don't know if Andrew got out, but he might still be in there." The owner's smile was not the kindly expression of consolation, but Donna couldn't see the cruelty in the man's eyes as he said, "I'm sure they'll find him in there." Donna squeezed her former boss tighter. "Let me give you a ride home, sweetheart. You're in no shape to drive." She nodded her head, her exhaustion draining away the little nervous energy she had left, and she allowed the Pimento Patch owner to escort her to his vehicle.